John had always been in control. As the CEO of one of the world's most successful tech companies, he was accustomed to having everything at his fingertips. The world was his to shape, his empire stretched across continents, his name known in every corner of the business world. At 52 years old, he was everything society deemed a success, wealthy, influential, and untouchable. His sprawling mansion on the hill was a symbol of his triumph, and his private jet was a constant reminder of the world he ruled with a level of precision and coldness few could rival. Yet, deep down, there was an emptiness he couldn't ignore. It wasn't something that screamed for attention, but rather a gnawing quietness that lingered when he was alone. Over the years, John had pushed his family away, had sacrificed relationships in pursuit of power. His daughter, Claire, had grown up in his shadow, a shadow he hadn't realized was crushing her until it was too late. He hadn't noticed her absence until she stopped coming to his events, until she disappeared from his life entirely. But he told himself it didn't matter. Work was everything, and success was the ultimate validation. He would have sworn that nothing could shake him, that his carefully curated world would never crumble. But one fateful morning, it began to unravel. The first sign of trouble came in a series of urgent emails late one evening. John was still in his office, sipping on a glass of bourbon, when his assistant informed him of a sudden financial crisis, a massive stock dip due to a botched investment in a startup that had failed to deliver. John shrugged it off at first, dismissing it as just another setback, another challenge to overcome. But as the night wore on, more bad news trickled in. Reports of mounting debts, partners pulling out, and markets collapsing. At first, he tried to handle it the way he always did, with calm, with control. He held an emergency board meeting the following morning, his team of executives standing nervously around him. The tension in the room was palpable as John looked each one of them in the eye. He was the leader, the one who had brought them all to the heights of success, and surely, he would be able to steer the ship back on course. But his confidence faltered as the day wore on. The numbers didn't add up. The calls from investors became more frequent and hostile. The threats of lawsuits and bankruptcy seemed to multiply by the hour. And in the midst of it all, his assistant, a trusted ally for years, sat in silence, unable to provide any reassurance. By the end of the week, the board of directors had made their decision. John was ousted. The company, once a beacon of innovation and prosperity, was now in the hands of new leadership. John, the titan of industry, was no longer in control. The next few weeks were a blur. John's life, once meticulously organized and cushioned by wealth, was collapsing around him. His prized possessions, the expensive cars, the designer clothes, the exclusive art collection, began to be auctioned off. His house, his sanctuary, was put on the market. And yet, as he watched his world shrink, a strange numbness overtook him. He couldn't feel the panic, the fear, that he thought would consume him. Instead, he felt detached, as if the world around him was moving in slow motion. On the day his mansion was sold to a new owner, John stood on the steps of the house, watching as strangers entered his home, taking over what had once been his kingdom. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: vulnerability. The fortress he had built, brick by brick, was now gone. And in its place, there was nothing but the empty streets ahead of him. It was on that very day, as John stood alone, unsure of where to go, that the first truly humbling moment of his life came. With nowhere to turn, he walked into the city, blending in with the crowd, trying to look like he belonged, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The people passing by didn't recognize him, didn't even glance in his direction. He was no longer the man who had once commanded attention in every room. He was a stranger, lost in a city that had once been his playground. The cold wind hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he wished he could retreat back into his old life. But that life no longer existed. He had nothing left to go back to. John's stomach growled as he walked aimlessly, realizing he hadn't eaten in hours. He found himself standing outside a small cafe. The warmth from inside was inviting, a stark contrast to the chill outside. Without thinking, he walked in, drawn to the familiar sense of comfort it offered. It wasn't the kind of upscale place he used to frequent, but it was warm, and for the first time in days, he felt the briefest flicker of hope. Inside, the cafe was dimly lit, with mismatched tables and chairs scattered across the room. A few regulars sat at the counter, sipping coffee, while the radio played softly in the background. Behind the counter stood David, a burly man in his mid-40s, wearing a faded apron. He noticed John immediately, the well-tailored suit, the air of someone who had once been someone important. But David didn't say anything. Instead, he simply nodded as John walked up to the counter. "Can I get you something?" David asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. John hesitated, then ordered a coffee, something simple. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his wallet, but there was no need. David waved him off. "No charge," David said, a hint of a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "First cups on the house." John frowned, unsure of how to react. The kindness felt foreign, out of place in a world that had once been all about transactions, about power. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't argue. He accepted the coffee and took a seat by the window. For a while, John sat there, nursing the warm cup in silence, watching the world pass by. The city outside was still the same, busy, indifferent, but it felt different now. More distant. More alien. David watched him from behind the counter, but said nothing. There was something in John's eyes, a deep, unspoken sorrow, that intrigued him. He'd seen his share of down-and-outs over the years, but this man, with his impeccable suit and sharp features, wasn't like the others. David had a feeling there was more to his story than just another failure. John sat in the cafe for hours, sipping his coffee slowly, the steam rising in tendrils around him. He watched the world pass by, each person absorbed in their own life, unaware of the silent man in the corner. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own insignificance. His former life, full of meetings, parties, and deals, seemed like a distant dream. He felt disconnected, like a character in a book that had been torn from its pages. David had returned to cleaning the counter, his eyes glancing over to John occasionally. There was something in his demeanor that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. He wasn't just the typical cafe owner. His posture, his eyes, his careful silence, all hinted at a deeper understanding of the world's complexities. And that intrigued John. After some time, David walked over to where John sat. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," he said, setting down a rag and leaning against the counter. John didn't respond right away. His thoughts were a tangled mess, but somehow, the straightforwardness of David's comment felt like a lifeline. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I had everything. Money, power, control. I could make anything happen. And now? Now I have nothing." David studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. "You don't really have nothing. You've got time now. Time's something a lot of people don't get, especially people like you." John felt a sharp pang of frustration. "Time," he echoed. "What good is time when you've lost everything that matters?" David's eyes softened. "What matters to you, exactly?" John hesitated. The question was more complex than he expected. What did matter to him now? What could possibly matter after everything had fallen apart? "I don't know anymore," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. David didn't press further. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to the counter, leaving John to stew in his own thoughts. The world outside was still moving, yet here he sat, adrift, lost in a city he once knew so well. It was around dusk when John's situation took a turn. He left the cafe with no clear destination in mind, his mind still swirling. As he walked down the street, past familiar buildings, it dawned on him just how invisible he had become. The doorman at the luxury apartment complex didn't even glance his way. The carriages of the people who once belonged to his world rolled past without a second thought. John tried to find comfort in his own bitterness, but the emptiness inside him only grew. He wandered aimlessly, not caring where he went. Eventually, he ended up near a bridge on the outskirts of town. The city lights flickered in the distance, but the air under the bridge was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the busy streets he had known. John stopped at the edge of the bridge and looked down at the dark water below. His thoughts spiraled into darker territories. What was the point of all this? Could he really go on like this, with nothing, no purpose, no future? Before he could lose himself completely in his thoughts, a voice called out to him. "Hey, you look lost." John turned sharply. Standing a few feet away was a woman, wrapped in a thin coat, her face partially obscured by a scarf. She looked about his age, though the roughness of her appearance suggested she had lived a harder life than he ever had. Her clothes were frayed, and her boots were worn. Despite the ragged appearance, there was a calmness in her demeanor that intrigued him. "I'm fine," John replied curtly, his pride refusing to let him admit otherwise. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't look like it." "I don't need your help," John snapped, then immediately regretted it. He had always been sharp with people, but in his current state, the words felt empty. The woman didn't seem bothered by his tone. Instead, she walked toward him, her eyes scanning him carefully. "I'm Samantha," she said, offering a hand. "And I don't think you're fine." "I've seen that look before." John stared at her hand, then shook it reluctantly. "John," he muttered, his mind still racing. Samantha took a step back and nodded as if she understood. "You know, I've been in your shoes." She gestured to her own worn clothes. "Once had a good job. Then life happened. You don't just lose your job. You lose your whole sense of self." John looked at her, curious. "What happened?" "People happened," she said simply. "Sometimes you trust the wrong ones, or maybe you just lose sight of what really matters. I was a corporate worker once. Good job, nice pay. Thought I was set. Until one day, I wasn't. No family, no savings, no friends who could help." She shrugged. "So, here I am. Just trying to get by." John looked at her, not knowing what to say. She was just like him, but the difference was that she had embraced her fall. It didn't seem to weigh her down the way it did him. Maybe it was because she had already accepted that life could be unpredictable. John, on the other hand, had built his identity on the stability of wealth and control, and now that it was gone, he was left adrift. "So, what do you do?" John asked, suddenly aware of how strange his question must have sounded. Samantha smiled, though it was a sad smile. "I survive. I make it through the day, one step at a time. I've got a few friends around here. They look out for me." She looked at him with a knowing expression. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. You might not have the mansion or the fancy car anymore, but you're still you. You just gotta figure out who that is now." John was silent for a long time, digesting her words. It was hard to accept, hard to let go of the image of who he thought he was. But maybe Samantha was right. Maybe this was the beginning of something else, something he had never considered, his own reinvention. That night, John slept in a small shelter on the outskirts of the city. The cot was uncomfortable and the cold seeped through the thin blanket. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. Samantha's words echoed in his mind as he drifted into a fitful sleep, "You're still you." John didn't know where this new path would lead, but perhaps, for the first time, he was open to finding out. The days following John's fall had blurred into a series of quiet, often lonely moments. No longer the wealthy and powerful businessman, John found himself adrift in a city he had once owned. The buildings, the streets, the very air felt alien to him now. Yet, the more time he spent without the trappings of his former life, the more he realized something important, something that had eluded him for years. It was Samantha who first pointed it out. At first, they spoke little about it. She had simply watched him, a quiet observer, understanding the struggles John had with his new identity. Over time, however, their conversations shifted, and she began to ask questions that cut deep. "You ever wonder," Samantha asked one evening as they sat on a worn bench overlooking the city lights, "why we only seem to value what we have when we lose it?" John had been silent for a long time, staring at the skyline. The question resonated with him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I think I spent my whole life focusing on the wrong things," he said slowly. "I was so wrapped up in proving something, either to myself or to the world, that I never stopped to ask myself if I was even on the right path." Samantha looked at him thoughtfully. "It's not just about the path. It's about the people you meet along the way. It's about what you learn through the struggle, not the success." John let her words sink in. For the first time, he thought about everything he had gained in his life, wealth, status, power, but how little of it had actually mattered in the end. He had been too focused on the climb, on winning, on looking for validation from the outside world. He had never truly examined what he needed to find peace, what kind of person he was at his core. Weeks went by, and John continued to work at the bookstore, now in a position where he didn't just feel like a man struggling to survive, but one who was beginning to understand the world differently. He noticed the way people interacted with each other, how those without the means to live comfortably still found joy, camaraderie, and purpose. The simple exchanges between strangers, the quiet understanding, and the sense of community, they were things John had never paid attention to before. But now, they were the very things he craved. One afternoon, a man came into the bookstore, asking for work. He had no experience, no references, but something about his desperation resonated with John. He gave the man a chance, offering him a small task for the day in exchange for a modest wage. The man was grateful, but John knew something more important had happened in that moment. For the first time in years, he had acted without thinking of the return. It wasn't about getting something in return, it was about offering a chance to someone who needed it. This realization became the foundation of everything John did moving forward. It was no longer about self-interest. It was about the impact he could have on others, the way he could provide for people who had been overlooked, just as he had once been. As time went on, John began to see the city differently. He understood that the world wasn't just a place to be conquered. It was a place to be shared. He learned that his worth wasn't defined by the size of his bank account or the power he once held. His worth, instead, was found in his capacity for empathy, understanding, and action. One evening, as he sat with Samantha after another long day, he reflected on how far he had come. "You were right," he said quietly. "I thought that success meant always being at the top, never showing weakness. But I see now that it's the way we treat people, how we help, how we listen, that truly defines us." Samantha nodded, her smile gentle. "That's the real lesson, John. It's not about what you lose, it's about what you learn. And you've learned how to truly live, how to be present in the world, without needing to dominate it." And so, John's journey became one of self-discovery, not in the way he had imagined. He didn't return to the life he once had. He didn't try to rebuild his empire or reclaim the wealth he had lost. Instead, he chose to focus on what truly mattered, the people around him, the relationships he could foster, and the way he could contribute to the world in a meaningful, sustainable way. John's story was no longer one of power or loss, but of understanding, a lesson in humility, empathy, and what it really means to be human.